May 11th, 1945. 0959 hours. 58 miles off Okinawa. The USS Bunker Hill cuts through the Pacific swell at 25 knots. Her flight deck crowded with aircraft preparing for the morning strike. Fighter Director Officer Lieutenant Commander J.A. Ballantyne stands in the Combat Information Center, watching the green sweep of the radar scope paint ghostly arcs across the darkness. Around him, talkers repeat coordinates into their headsets, their voices calm, methodical. The air smells of electronics and coffee gone cold in paper cups. On the flight deck, aviation machinists mate Second Class James O'Neill wipes hydraulic fluid from his hands as he moves between the rows of Corsairs and Hellcats. The sun stands high and brutal overhead, turning the steel deck into a griddle that radiates heat through the soles of his boots. Plane handlers in their colored jerseys, yellow for directors, blue for chalk men, red for ordnance, move in practiced choreography around the aircraft. The whine of starting engines mixes with the bark of orders and the metallic clang of tie-down chains being released. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick sits in the cockpit of his F-4U Corsair, running through his pre-flight checklist. His gloved fingers move across switches and gauges with automatic precision. Behind him, 17 more Corsairs wait their turn on the catapult. The Combat Air Patrol has been airborne since dawn, orbiting the fleet in layered defensive rings. But there are always gaps. There are always gaps. At 1004 hours, the Combat Information Center picks up a bogey inbound from the north. The plot shows two contacts, low and fast, hugging the wave tops where radar coverage thins to almost nothing. The fighter direction officer vectors the nearest CAP section toward the intercept, but the geometry is wrong. The kamikazes are already inside the screen. Aboard the Yokosuka D-4, Y-3 Suisei, the Judy dive bomber in American nomenclature, 23-year-old Lieutenant Seizo Yasunori holds his control stick with both hands. The aircraft shudders as he pushes the throttle to combat power, the engine howling behind the thin firewall. His observer and radio man, 19-year-old petty officer, First Class Yoshiaki Nakatsuru, sits in the rear cockpit, his hands pressed flat against his knees. Neither man speaks. There is nothing left to say. The hachimaki headbands they wear beneath their leather helmets are inscribed with prayers their mothers wrote by hand. The characters blur in Yasunori's peripheral vision as sweat runs into his eyes. The Bunker Hill appears suddenly through the morning haze, her gray hull enormous against the blue water. Yasunori can see the black numerals painted on her island, CV-17. His aircraft is loaded with a single 250-kilogram bomb. It will be enough. He has been told it will be enough. On the Bunker Hill's flight deck, a plane handler named Robert read. Jenkins looks up at the wrong moment and sees the Judy dropping out of the sun. The dive bomber is already too close, its fixed landing gear giving it the appearance of a bird of prey with talons extended. Jenkins opens his mouth to shout a warning, but the words catch in his throat. The kamikaze strikes the flight deck at 1005 hours. The impact occurs 30 feet aft of the forward elevator. The aircraft's bomb detonates on contact, punching through the wooden deck planking and exploding in the gallery deck below. The blast wave travels outward at supersonic velocity, turning metal into shrapnel and shrapnel into flying razors that cut through flesh and fabric and thin aluminum without distinction. 34 men die in the first second. The aviation gasoline in the Judy's ruptured tanks ignites, spilling liquid fire across the deck and down through the torn opening into the hangar deck below. James O'Neill is thrown backward by the concussion. He lands hard on his shoulder, the wind knocked from his lungs. When he opens his eyes, he sees flames spreading across the flight deck like spilled paint, moving with unnatural speed toward the rows of armed and fueled aircraft. Men are running, their shapes dark silhouettes against the orange inferno. Some of them are on fire. Before O'Neill can stand, a second kamikaze strikes the ship. Lieutenant Kiyoshi Ogawa has followed Yasunori through the fleet screen, his Mitsubishi A6M50 fighter stripped of armor and extra ammunition to increase speed. He sees the first explosion bloom on the American carrier's deck and knows his comrade has succeeded. Now it is his turn to honor the Emperor. His turn to justify the trust placed in him by his instructors at Kaneohe Air Base, who bowed to the departing pilots as if they were already spirits. Ogawa Zero carries no bomb, just its full internal fuel load. He aims for the island structure where the antennas and radar dishes cluster like metal flowers. The Zero hits the base of the island at 1007 hours, 2 minutes and 15 seconds after the first impact. The aircraft disintegrates on contact, but its momentum carries fragments of engine and airframe into the island structure. Aviation fuel sprays across the flag bridge, the navigation bridge, the signal bridge. Men are incinerated where they stand, their bodies carbonized in the flash heat that exceeds 2,000 degrees. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, is blown off his feet by the explosion. His staff officers drag him through smoke so thick it has texture, a black cotton that fills lungs and throats and makes breathing an act of will. On the navigation bridge, the ship's executive officer, Commander Henry Seitz, takes shrapnel in both legs but remains standing, shouting orders to the helmsman through the flames. Below decks, the hangar bay has become an inferno. 34 aircraft are parked wing to wing in the enclosed space, their fuel tanks topped off for the morning strike. The fire from the first kamikaze hit drops through the torn deck and lands among them like a match in a gasoline warehouse. Aircraft began exploding in sequence, each detonation feeding the next. Ordnance cooks off, 500-pound bombs, rockets, .50 caliber ammunition, turning the hangar into a killing box where shrapnel ricochets off bulkheads and deck beams. In Damage Control Central, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Carmichael watches the damage control board light up with casualty reports. Red lights bloom across the ship's schematic like blood spreading through water. Fires on the flight deck. Fires in the hangar bay. Fires in the gallery deck, the second deck, the third deck. Flooding in 2 compartments forward. The forward elevator jammed at hangar deck level. Casualties mounting by the second. 34 dead becomes 50. 50 becomes 100. 100 becomes 200. Carmichael reaches for the sound-powered phone that connects him to the repair parties stationed throughout the ship. His hand is steady. The men in his division have trained for this moment since boot camp. They have fought simulated fires in enclosed trainers filled with burning oil. They have practiced shoring bulkheads while instructors threw smoke grenades and shut-off lighting circuits. They have learned to function in heat that melts plastic and smoke that reduces visibility to inches. Now the training becomes real. "This is Damage Control Central," Carmichael says into the phone, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced calm. "All repair parties execute emergency firefighting procedures. Hangar deck sprinkler system activate on my mark. Mark." The water comes from above like a steel curtain. In the hangar bay, aviation machinist's mate First Class Robert Blanchard feels the deluge hit his shoulders with enough force to stagger him. The sprinkler system, installed after the lessons learned from the burning carriers at Midway, activates across the entire hangar deck simultaneously. Thousands of gallons per minute cascade from ceiling-mounted nozzles, the pressure so intense it strips paint from bulkheads. The water hits the burning gasoline and creates steam that rises in white columns, mixing with the black smoke to create a gray fog that reduces the hangar to a nightmare landscape of shadows and flames. Blanchard wears an oxygen-breathing apparatus, the OBA, strapped to his chest, the mouthpiece gripped between his teeth. The rubber seal cuts into his face, but the device allows him to breathe in the toxic atmosphere. He can hear his own breathing, loud and mechanical, echoing in his ears. Around him, other members of Repair Party 2 advance toward the fires with fog nozzles that spray water in wide, cooling patterns. The nozzle men work in pairs, one holding the brass nozzle while another handles the charged hose that writhes like a serpent behind them. The heat is extraordinary, even through his asbestos proximity suit, a silver-coated garment that reflects radiant heat. Blanchard feels his skin tightening, baking. The suit's gloves are thick enough to stop him from feeling the nozzle properly, so he works by muscle memory and instinct. Advance 3 steps. Spray the fire. Advance 3 more steps. Spray again. The fire retreats grudgingly, giving up deck space foot by foot. Behind the fire parties, hull technicians and shipfitters move through the steam and smoke with portable pumps and wooden shoring beams. Their job is to contain the flooding that threatens the ship's stability. The first kamikaze strike ruptured a void space below the waterline, allowing tons of seawater to pour into compartments that were designed to remain dry. If the flooding continues unchecked, the Bunker Hill will develop a list that makes firefighting impossible and abandonment inevitable. Hull technician second class Walter Donovan works by touch in a flooded compartment on the second deck, the water rising past his waist. His hands move across the buckled bulkhead, feeling for the crack that's letting the Pacific Ocean into the ship. The darkness is absolute. The battle lanterns failed when the electrical system went down. Donovan works with a waterproof flashlight clamped between his teeth, its beam cutting through the murk in a narrow white line. He finds the rupture by feel, a 6-inch split in the plating where the pressure wave from the bomb blast peeled metal back like paper. Water jets through the opening with the force of a fire hose. Donovan pulls a wooden shoring plank from the bundle strapped to his back and wedges it against the crack, hammering it into place with a rubber mallet. The wood groans under the pressure, but holds. He adds a second plank, then a third, building a patch that reduces the flooding to a manageable seep. Compartment A204 secured. He shouts into the sound-powered phone handset hanging on the bulkhead. Water drips from his chin as he speaks. Moving to A206. On the flight deck, the fire has taken on a life of its own. Aviation gasoline burns with the hungry yellow flame that consumes oxygen faster than the wind can replace it. Men fighting the fires find themselves gasping, their vision tunneling, their muscles turning to water. Some collapse where they stand. Others drag them to the catwalk and continue fighting. Fire Control Man Third Class Eugene Davis mans a deck-mounted fire monitor, a large-caliber water cannon capable of throwing 2,000 gallons per minute across 50 yards. The monitor is fixed to the deck by steel bolts and requires 2 men to aim it properly. Davis's partner, Seaman First Class Marcus Webb, holds the training wheel while Davis adjusts the elevation. They direct the stream at a burning Corsair whose magnesium engine case burns with a white-hot intensity that makes looking at it directly painful. The water hits the burning aircraft and explodes into steam. The Corsair's ammunition cooks off, tracers zipping across the deck in chaotic patterns. Davis and Webb throw themselves flat as a stream of .50 caliber rounds passes over their heads, the rounds making a sound like ripping canvas. When the firing stops, they climb back to their feet and resume their work without speaking. In the island structure, Commander Seitz has established an emergency command post on the signal bridge. Blood soaks through the bandages wrapped around his legs, but he remains upright by gripping a stanchion with one hand while using the other to hold a telephone handset. Around him, signal men work to restore communications with the rest of the fleet. The primary radio masts were destroyed in the second kamikaze hit, forcing them to rig emergency antennas using wire and ingenuity. This is Bunker Hill. Seitz transmits on the fleet tactical frequency. We have suffered major damage from 2 kamikaze hits. Fires in hangar bay and flight deck. Casualties heavy. Damage control parties engaged. We are maintaining position with fleet. On the escort carrier USS Kitkan Bay, 15 miles to the southeast, radio men copy the transmission and relay it to Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the battleship USS New Mexico. Spruance listens to the report with an expression that reveals nothing. He has seen carriers burn before, the Lexington at Coral Sea, the Yorktown at Midway, the Princeton at Lady Gulf. He knows the statistics. A carrier that suffers fires on both the flight deck and hangar deck has a survival rate below 30%. Sent to Bunker Hill, Spruance tells his communications officer. All available assistance being dispatched. Maintain fleet station if able. But Spruance knows that assistance means little against fires of this magnitude. The destroyers racing toward the Bunker Hill carry firefighting equipment and medical supplies, but they cannot board the burning carrier while she maintains speed. The Bunker Hill must save herself. Her crew must save her. Everything depends on the training and discipline of the men now fighting for their ship's survival. Below decks and repair locker 2, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Bradley coordinates the damage control effort from a small compartment lined with tools, equipment, and damage control charts. The charts show the ship's internal layout in precise detail, every compartment, every passageway, every void space. Bradley marks the chart with a grease pencil as reports come in from the repair parties, creating a real-time map of the battle being fought inside the ship. Fire in hangar bay spreading aft. A voice reports through the phone circuit. Request additional foam to Sector 3. Bradley checks his equipment inventory. Negative on foam. Sector 3 shifts to water and CO2. Pull backhoes teams from Sector 1 to support. The decisions come in rapid succession. Where to deploy the limited supply of firefighting foam. Which compartments to flood to create fire breaks. When to seal watertight doors, even though men might still be trapped on the other side. Bradley makes the calls with the cold logic of triage, always calculating the greatest good for the greatest number. Some men will die so that others might live. Some compartments will be sacrificed so that others can be saved. This is the mathematics of damage control. In the hangar bay, the fires begin to lose ground. The combination of water from a sprinkler system and the fog nozzles operated by the repair parties creates enough cooling to prevent the flames from spreading further aft. The temperature drops from unbearable to merely agonizing. Men advance on the burning aircraft, surrounding each one with multiple hose streams until the flames suffocate and die. Aviation machinist's Mate Blanchard reaches the wreckage of a helldiver that is burned down to its structural skeleton. The aluminum skin has melted away, leaving only the steel frame and engine mount. He directs his fog nozzle at the hot metal, watching the water flash to steam on contact. Gradually, the red glow fades to black. Another aircraft secured. At 1,047 hours, 43 minutes after the first kamikaze impact, the hangar bay fires are declared under control. Not extinguished, but contained. No longer spreading. The flight deck fires continue to burn, but their fury has diminished. The men of the Bunker Hill have bought themselves time. In sick bay, the medical staff works in controlled chaos. The wounded arrive in an endless stream, burned victims, blast casualties, men suffering from smoke inhalation and shock. Chief Pharmacist's Mate John Henderson performs triage at the entrance, sorting the casualties with brutal efficiency. Those who can be saved get immediate attention. Those who cannot are made comfortable and moved aside. There is no time for sentiment. A sailor is carried in with third-degree burns, covering 60% of his body. Henderson looks at the burns, notes the victim's already blood pressure, and makes his decision. Morphine and water. Make him comfortable. The sailor will not survive the hour. The medical supplies must go to those with a chance. The final count, when it comes, will shock the fleet. 389 men dead, 264 wounded, nearly a third of the ship's air group killed or incapacitated. The Bunker Hill has lost more men in 5 minutes than most ships lose in a year of combat, but she is still afloat, still fighting, still a warship, and on the navigation bridge. Commander Seitz looks at the chronometer and makes a decision that will define the next 3 hours of his life. Sound general quarters, he orders. Prepare to resume flight operations. 1,800 miles to the west, on the island of Kyushu, Lieutenant Commander Takehiko Aina sits in a wicker chair outside the operations building at Kanoya Air Base and watches the sunset turn the East China Sea to molten copper. The base loudspeakers crackle with static and pop music, American jazz captured from radio broadcasts and played as a form of psychological warfare against the pilots who know they are being sent to die. Aina is 27 years old. He commands the 5th Koku Sentai, the Shinpo Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Force. The Americans call them kamikazes, but Aina dislikes the term. It reduces the complexity of their mission to a single word, a single concept, as if dying for the Emperor were that simple. Around the airfield, ground crews prepare aircraft for the next morning's sortie. Mechanics work by the light of electric lamps. the shadows dancing across the wings of Zeros and Judas that will never return to this base. The mechanics treat each aircraft with careful attention, knowing that their work represents the last service they can provide to the pilots who will fly these machines into American ships. In a barracks building at the edge of the airfield, 19-year-old Ensign Haruo Higashiyama writes a letter to his mother. The characters flow across the rice paper in precise, traditional script. He describes the cherry blossoms that bloomed near the base in April, now long since fallen. He assures her that he faces his duty with a pure heart and that she should take pride in his sacrifice. He does not mention that his hands shake when he holds a control stick, or that he sometimes wakes in the night with his heart hammering and his lungs unable to draw breath. Higashiyama seals the letter and places it in the wooden box where such letters are collected. Tomorrow he will climb into a Zero fighter loaded with explosives and aim it at an American warship. His instructors have told him that his death will cripple the American advance, that the loss of their carriers will force them to negotiate a peace that preserves the empire. Higashiyama wants to believe this is true, but reports have been filtering back from the fleet, carried by reconnaissance aircraft and submarines. Reports that confuse and disturb the command staff. American carriers that should be sinking are instead returning to action within hours. The carrier Intrepid was hit by a kamikaze on November 25, 1944. Naval intelligence confirmed the strike, yet she was back on station 5 days later. The Essex was hit on November 26th and resumed flight operations the same day. The Franklin was devastated by bombs in March, her flight deck torn open, her hangar bay gutted by fires, her list so severe that abandonment seemed certain. Yet she survived. She made it back to Pearl Harbor. She will return to service. Lieutenant Commander Aina knows these reports are true because he has seen the reconnaissance photographs. American carriers that should be at the bottom of the Pacific are instead steaming with the fleet, launching aircraft, conducting combat operations. It is impossible. It contradicts everything the Navy has taught about carrier vulnerability. A single bomb penetrating the hangar deck should trigger catastrophic fires that consume the ship. This is what happened to Japanese carriers at Midway. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu all lost to fires that began with single bomb hits. This is what happened to the Shokaku at the Philippine Sea, torpedoed and consumed by aviation gasoline fires that defeated all attempts at control. American carriers should burn the same way. They carry the same volatile aviation gasoline. They pack their hangar decks with the same densely arranged aircraft. The laws of physics do not change based on nationality. Fire consumes oxygen and fuel without regard to the flag painted on a ship's hull. Yet the Americans do not burn. In Tokyo, at the headquarters of the combined fleet, intelligence officers struggle to explain the discrepancy. Some theorize that American damage control is more effective than anticipated. Others suggest that the reconnaissance reports are exaggerated or that the carriers spotted returning to action are different ships than those hit by kamikazes. A few, speaking in whispers, suggest that the suicide attacks are failing to achieve their strategic objectives. This last suggestion is dangerous. The kamikaze program represents the Empire's last hope of forestalling invasion. More than 4,000 aircraft have been set aside for suicide missions. More than 7,000 pilots have volunteered, some eagerly, some under pressure so subtle it might as well be invisible, but all committed to the mission. If the kamikazes are failing, if American carriers cannot be sunk by these desperate measures, then the war is already lost. Rear Admiral Mato Magaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, refuses to accept this conclusion. He has personally briefed pilots before their final missions, bowing to them with the respect due to men who embrace certain death. He has watched them take off from Kanoya and Miyazaki in Kokubu, their aircraft overloaded with bombs and fuel, their wheels barely clearing the runway. He has read their final letters, filled with poetry and patriotism and profound sadness. These men deserve to die for a purpose. The American carriers are vulnerable, Ogaki tells his staff during a briefing at Kanoya. Our pilots are succeeding. The problem is not effectiveness, it is scale. We must increase the tempo of operations. More sorties, More pilots, more hits. But privately, alone in his quarters, Agaki studies the intelligence reports and feels doubt gnawing at his certainty. The photographs show the USS Franklin, a ship that should be dead, alongside a pier at Pearl Harbor. Her flight deck is scarred and blackened, but intact. Her island structure shows damage, but remains standing. Work crews swarm across her hull like ants. She is being repaired. She will return to war. How? The question haunts Agaki. Japanese carriers cannot survive such damage. The doctrine of naval aviation, developed over decades and refined in war, confirms that carriers are fragile. They trade armor for aircraft capacity. They sacrifice survivability for striking power. A carrier that takes major damage must withdraw from battle for months of repairs. This is known. This is proven. Except the Americans have changed the rules. The revolution began in 1942, in the aftermath of disaster. At the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, a team of engineering officers studied the loss of carriers at Coral Sea and Midway with forensic intensity. They examined damage reports, interviewed survivors, and reviewed after-action analyses until they could reconstruct the sequence of events that turned aircraft carriers into burning coffins. The findings were damning. American carrier design, inherited from pre-war theory and constrained by treaty limitations, prioritized aircraft capacity over survivability. The hangar decks were enclosed spaces that turned into blast furnaces when aviation gasoline ignited. The firefighting systems were inadequate, designed to handle small fires, not conflagrations fed by thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel. The damage control training was insufficient, teaching sailors to fight fires as individuals rather than as coordinated teams. Most critically, the doctrine was wrong. American carrier doctrine assumed that damage control began after the battle, when the ship reached port and repair crews could assess the destruction. The concept of fighting fires while simultaneously fighting the enemy, of conducting combat operations while half the ship burned, was not seriously contemplated. The Japanese, ironically, had already learned this lesson. At Midway, the carrier Hiryu continued launching strikes even after being hit by bombs. The crew fought fires while arming aircraft, cleared wreckage while launching fighters. They kept fighting until the ship's destruction became mathematically certain. Their courage was extraordinary. Their training was inadequate. Captain Armand Morgan, assigned to lead the Navy's new damage control school in Philadelphia, understood that courage without competence produced only corpses. He needed to transform damage control from an afterthought into a science, from a collection of individual heroics into a systematic discipline that could be taught, practiced, and executed under the worst possible conditions. Morgan began by studying fire, not in theory but in practice. He had training facilities constructed that replicated the conditions aboard a burning carrier, enclosed spaces, burning oil, toxic smoke, and temperatures that exceeded human tolerance. He put sailors into these hellscapes and taught them to function despite the fear that screamed at them to flee. He taught them to crawl beneath smoke layers where breathable air existed. He taught them to recognize backdraft conditions and flashover warning signs. He taught them to fight fires in teams where each man's survival depended on every other man's competence. The training was brutal. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Some quit, but those who completed the course emerged with skills that transcended anything taught in pre-war damage control training. They knew how to fight fires that should be uncontrollable. They knew how to shore bulkheads that should collapse. They knew how to keep a dying ship alive long enough to get her crew to safety. But Morgan knew that training alone was insufficient. The ships themselves needed to change. Working with naval architects at the Bureau of Ships, Morgan pushed for modifications to carrier design that would improve survivability. The hangar deck sprinkler systems were upgraded from afterthoughts to robust firefighting networks capable of delivering thousands of gallons per minute. The flight decks were coated with multiple layers of non-skid compound that could be rapidly patched if damaged. Ventilation systems were modified to prevent smoke from spreading through the ship like poison gas. Firefighting stations were positioned throughout the vessel, pre-stocked with equipment and supplied with independent power systems that could operate even if the main electrical grid failed. Most importantly, the doctrine changed. Damage control became a primary mission, equal in importance to launching aircraft or firing weapons. Every sailor received damage control training as part of basic education. Every officer qualified in firefighting and flood control. Repair parties trained constantly, running drills until the procedures became automatic reflexes that could be executed in darkness, in smoke, under fire. The Essex-class carriers, commissioned beginning in 1943, incorporated these lessons from the keel up. Their design philosophy represented a fundamental shift in naval architecture, where pre-war carriers sacrificed protection for aircraft capacity. The Essex-class balanced survivability with striking power. The hangar decks included multiple fire zones that could be isolated from each other. The aviation gasoline storage systems incorporated triple redundant safety mechanisms. The damage control stations were armored against blast effects and supplied with oxygen systems that allowed repair parties to function in toxic atmospheres. By 1945, when the USS Bunker Hill takes her 2 kamikaze hits off Okinawa, American carrier damage control has evolved into something approaching a dark art, a combination of engineering precision, trained instinct, and institutionalized aggression that refuses to accept ship loss as inevitable. The Japanese do not understand this evolution because they have not experienced it themselves. Japanese carriers still operate under pre-war doctrine that assumes major damage equals mission kill. Their damage control training remains cursory, adequate for peacetime accidents, grossly insufficient for combat casualties. Their repair parties lack the equipment, the training, and most critically, the doctrine that would allow them to save ships that should be lost. When the carrier Taiho was torpedoed in June 1944, the damage was initially minor, a single hole in the hull, controllable flooding, no casualties. But aviation gasoline vapors from ruptured fuel lines accumulated throughout the ship. 6 hours after the torpedo hit, a junior officer triggered an electrical switch. The spark ignited the gasoline vapors. The Taiho disappeared in a single massive explosion that killed 1,650 men and sent the carrier to the bottom in minutes. Proper ventilation and damage control could have prevented the disaster, but those systems and procedures did not exist in the Japanese fleet. The Shokaku, torpedoed 1 hour after the Taiho, suffered from gasoline fires that the crew could not contain. The ship burned for 3 hours before exploding and sinking with 1,263 men. Again, the damage was survivable. The fires were controllable, but the training and equipment necessary to save the ship did not exist. American carriers facing similar damage survive because their crews know how to fight fires that should be uncontrollable. They survive because their ships are designed to take damage and continue functioning. They survive because doctrine and training and engineering have combined to create vessels that refuse to die. The revolution is invisible to Japanese intelligence because it is not about technology. The Essex-class carriers use the same basic materials as Japanese carriers: steel hulls, aluminum aircraft, aviation gasoline. The revolution is about organization, training, and doctrine. It is about men who have practiced firefighting until the procedures become instinctive. It is about officers who understand that saving the ship is more important than saving themselves. It is about an institutional commitment to survivability that permeates every level of the fleet. When Lieutenant Commander Aina watches his pilots take off from Kanoya, he believes they are striking fatal blows against the American fleet. He believes that each kamikaze hit will remove a carrier from combat for months. He believes this because his experience tells him it must be true. His experience is 20 years out of date. At 1,115 hours, 76 minutes after the first kamikaze impact, Commander Seitz receives a report from Damage Control Central that changes everything. Forward flight deck structurally sound. Lieutenant Commander Carmichael reports, his voice crackling through the sound-powered phone circuit. Heat damage to deck planking in Sector 2, but supporting I-beams intact. We can patch and operate. Seitz looks at the flight deck through the shattered windows of the navigation bridge. The scene resembles a vision of industrial hell. Twisted metal, burning wreckage, and black smoke rising in columns that bend in the wind. The dead lie where they fell, covered with shelter halves and canvas tarps. The wounded have been evacuated, but their blood remains, sticky and dark on the steel deck. Yet Carmichael is right. The flight deck is damaged but not destroyed. The structure beneath the planking, the heavy steel I-beams that carry the weight of landing aircraft, remains intact. The wooden deck planking, a 3-inch layer of Douglas fir treated with non-skid compound, has been scorched and splintered by the explosions, but it can be replaced. More importantly, it can be patched. How long? Seitz asks. Carmichael pauses. Seitz can hear him conferring with his damage control officers, voices overlapping in urgent discussion. 3 hours to clear wreckage and patch the deck. 4 hours to restore full flight operations. 3 hours. Seitz makes a calculation that balances tactical necessity against crew exhaustion. The fleet needs carriers. Task Force 58 is supporting the invasion of Okinawa, where Marines and soldiers are dying on beaches and in caves, while Japanese artillery pounds them from concealed positions. Those ground troops need air support, close air support from carrier aircraft that can respond within minutes of a call for help. Every carrier matters. Every flight deck matters. Do it. Seitz orders. Notify air operations to prepare for flight ops at 1,400 hours. The order ripples through the ship like an electric current. In the hangar bay, repair crews shift from firefighting to wreckage removal. Sailors with cutting torches move among the burned aircraft, severing twisted metal and clearing debris. The work is dangerous. Unexploded ordnance lies scattered throughout the wreckage, bombs and rockets that cooked in the fires but failed to detonate. Ordnance disposal teams mark these hazards with red flags while they carefully extract and dispose of each item. On the flight deck, a crew of 30 carpenters from the ship's company begins the task of repairing the damaged planking. These are not professional shipwrights. They are sailors who learned carpentry in the Navy's technical schools and practiced it during peacetime maintenance periods. Now they work with pre-cut wooden sections stored in the ship's workshops specifically for flight deck repair. The sections are 8 feet long and 3 inches thick, cut to fit between the steel I-beams. The carpenters work in teams of 3. One man measures and marks the damaged area. One man operates a circular saw to cut the damaged planking away, and one man fits and nails the replacement section into place. The work proceeds with methodical speed. Each damaged section takes approximately 10 minutes to replace. The carpenters work in a line, moving across the flight deck from forward to aft, leaving behind them a patchwork of new and old wood that will be finished with non-skid compound once the replacements are secured. Aviation machinist Mate O'Neill, who survived both kamikaze impacts through luck and timing, joins a crew clearing wreckage from the starboard catwalk. They use cable and portable winches to drag twisted metal over the side, where it falls into the Pacific with splashes that send up plumes of white water. Each piece removed represents another step toward operational status. Each cleared foot of deck brings the ship closer to resuming its mission. In the hangar bay, the work is grimmer. The fires have been extinguished, but the aftermath resembles a foundry after an explosion. 34 aircraft have been destroyed, burned down to skeletal frames, or simply vaporized in the fuel-fed inferno. The hangar bay overhead is blackened with soot. Electrical cables hang like vines from severed conduits. The deck is covered with a mixture of water, foam, aviation gasoline, and blood. Lieutenant Junior Grade Bradley coordinates the salvage operation from Repair Locker 2. His grease pencil marks on the damage control chart now show areas being restored rather than areas burning. The transition from crisis to recovery is subtle but significant. The ship is no longer dying. She is healing. Elevator status. Bradley asks into phone circuit. Forward elevator jammed at hangar deck level. The reply comes back. Hydraulics damage beyond field repair. Recommend welding in place and operating with aft elevator only. Bradley marks the chart. The forward elevator is a loss, but not a critical one. The aft elevator can handle flight operations. albeit at reduced capacity. He makes a note to inform air operations of the limitation. Throughout the ship, similar calculations are being made. Which systems can be repaired? Which must be written off? Where can damage be temporarily bypassed with emergency rigging? The decisions come faster as the crew settles into the rhythm of damage control work, the strange calm that follows combat, where exhaustion and urgency combine into a state of focused efficiency. In the after-engine room, machinists work to restore the ship's full propulsion capability. One of the two massive reduction gears that transfer power from the steam turbines to the propeller shafts has been damaged by the shock of the explosions. The damage is not severe. A few sheared bolts, some misaligned bearings, but it limits the ship to three-quarter speed. Machinists mate First-Class Theodore Palmer works by flashlight in the narrow space between the reduction gear casing and the bulkhead, his hands moving across the machinery with practiced familiarity. He replaces sheared bolts with spares from the ship's machine shop, torquing each one to specification using a calibrated wrench. Reduction gear secured for full power operation. Palmer reports at 1,243 hours. The engine room passes the information to the bridge, where Commander Seitz receives it with satisfaction. Full power means the Bunker Hill can maintain station with the fleet, can run from danger if necessary, can generate the 30 knots of wind over deck required for flight operations. By 1330 hours, the flight deck has been cleared of major wreckage. The carpenter crews have replaced 42 sections of damaged planking. The deck still shows scars, blackened areas where the fires burned hottest, patches of new wood standing out pale against the weathered gray. But it is structurally sound. Aircraft can land. Aircraft can launch. In the ready rooms, pilots who survived the kamikaze attack sit in their leather chairs and try not to think about the friends who died on the flight deck. They review their strike assignments for the afternoon mission, targets in southern Okinawa, Japanese artillery positions that are shelling American positions. The mission briefings continue as if nothing has happened, because stopping would mean acknowledging that everything has changed. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, whose Corsair was spotted on the starboard catapult when the kamikazes hit, prepares to lead the first strike. His aircraft survived the fires through pure chance. It was far enough forward to escape the worst of the inferno. Now it sits on the newly patched deck, its engine ticking as it cools in the afternoon sun. Hedrick walks around the aircraft, conducting his pre-flight inspection with the same careful attention he gives every mission. The routine provides comfort, a return to normal when nothing feels normal. At 1,355 hours, 5 hours and 50 minutes after the first kamikaze impact, the Bunker Hill's loudspeakers crackle to life. Flight quarters, flight quarters. All hands man your flight quarter stations. Prepare to launch aircraft. The announcement represents a moment of defiance that reverberates across the Pacific. The Bunker Hill, which should be dead or withdrawing for months of repairs, is instead preparing to resume combat operations less than 6 hours after suffering catastrophic damage. On the flag bridge, Admiral Mitcher, who was blown off his feet by the second kamikaze and evacuated to the destroyer USS English, receives the news via radio. He nods once, unsurprised. This is what American carriers do. They take damage that should be fatal and they survive. They burn and they rebuild. They absorb punishment that would sink any other ship and they continue fighting. Signal to Bunker Hill. Mitcher tells his communications officer, "Well done. Resume assigned duties." The message is quintessentially Navy, understated to the point of absurdity. 389 men have died. The ship has survived 2 direct kamikaze hits. The crew has fought fires that should have consumed the vessel, and the Admiral's response is well done. But for the men of the Bunker Hill, exhausted and grieving and determined, those 2 words mean everything. The reconnaissance photographs arrive at Kanoya Air Base 3 days after the attack. Lieutenant Commander Aina studies the images spread across the operations table under harsh electric lights. The photographs were taken by a lone Nakajima C-6N Mert reconnaissance aircraft that penetrated the American fleet screen at dawn, flying so high that anti-aircraft fire could not reach it. The pilot risked his life to bring back these images, evidence of the American fleet's status in the aftermath of the Kamikaze campaign. The photographs show Task Force 58 operating 70 miles east of Okinawa. Aina counts the carriers visible in the frame, 7 escort carriers for fleet carriers. He searches the images for the Bunker Hill, trying to match the ship's profile against the silhouettes in the recognition manual. There, the 3rd carrier in the northern group. The profile is unmistakable. The Bunker Hill is with the fleet, not burning, not sinking, not withdrawing for repairs. 3 days after taking 2 direct kamikaze hits, attacks that Aina's pilots reported as successful, the American carrier is conducting flight operations. Aina sets down the magnifying glass and closes his eyes. The evidence is incontrovertible. The kamikazes are failing to achieve their strategic objective. They are hitting American ships. The pilot's reports confirm this. The reconnaissance photographs confirm this. But the Americans are not being driven from the battlefield. They are absorbing the attacks and continuing to fight. In Tokyo, the combined fleet staff receives similar intelligence with mounting concern. The USS Franklin, reported as destroyed in March, is photographed alongside a pier at Pearl Harbor undergoing repairs. Naval architects studying the images estimate she will return to service within months, not years. The USS Intrepid, hit 5 times by kamikazes between October and April, continues operating with the fleet. The USS Essex, the USS Hancock, the USS Wasp, all have taken kamikaze damage. All have returned to combat. The implications are staggering. The kamikaze program has expended more than 1,900 aircraft in direct attacks against the American fleet since April 1st. Approximately 11% of these attacks successfully strike their targets. By any measure, this represents an extraordinary hit rate, far higher than conventional bombing or torpedo attack. Yet the Americans continue advancing. The fleet continues operating. The carriers continue launching strikes against Japanese positions on Okinawa. The problem, the intelligence officers conclude, is not accuracy. The problem is survivability. American carriers are demonstrating a resilience that Japanese carriers cannot match. When the Hiryu was hit at Midway, she burned and sank. When the Shokaku was torpedoed at Philippine Sea, she exploded and sank. When the Zuikaku took bombs at Leyte Gulf, she burned and sank. Japanese carriers, when severely damaged, die. American carriers do not die. They burn, they list, they suffer catastrophic casualties, and then they resume flight operations. On May 14th, 3 days after the Bunker Hill attack, a kamikaze strikes the USS Enterprise. The aircraft hits the forward elevator, blowing it 400 feet into the air. The explosion kills 14 men and starts fires on the flight deck and in the hangar bay. Enterprise's damage control parties extinguished the fires in 45 minutes. The ship resumes flight operations within 2 hours. 2 hours, the time it takes for a Japanese carrier to burn to her waterline, the Enterprise uses to clear wreckage and resume combat operations. Rear Admiral Igaki receives this intelligence and struggles to understand. He has devoted his career to naval aviation. He understands carriers as complex weapon systems that balance striking power against vulnerability. The doctrine is clear. Carriers trade armor for aircraft capacity. They accept fragility as the price of offensive capability. A carrier that takes major damage must withdraw. Except the Americans have rewritten the doctrine. They have found a way to maintain striking power while improving survivability. They have created carriers that refuse to die, crewed by sailors who refuse to abandon ship. Igaki meets with his operations officers in the bunker beneath Kanoya's operations building. The room is cool and dark, lit by electric bulbs that cast harsh shadows across the maps spread on the planning table. The maps show the American fleet's positions updated daily by reconnaissance reports. The positions never change in the ways Igaki expects. Ships that should be sinking remain on station. Carriers that should be withdrawing for repairs continue launching strikes. We must increase the frequency of attacks. Igaki tells his staff. More sorties. More targets. We must overwhelm their defenses. But privately, He knows this is desperation speaking. The kamikaze program was conceived as a weapon of strategic dislocation, a means of inflicting casualties so severe that the Americans would negotiate rather than invade the home islands. The assumption was that sinking or crippling American carriers would remove them from combat for extended periods, gradually reducing the fleet's offensive capability until it could no longer support invasion operations. The assumption was wrong. American carriers are not being removed from combat. They are being damaged and repaired and returned to action faster than Japanese intelligence believed possible. The kamikaze program is killing American sailors, thousands of them, but it is not achieving its strategic objective. It is not stopping the American advance. On Okinawa, the battle continues with mounting casualties on both sides. American Marines fight through caves and fortifications, supported by naval gunfire and carrier aircraft. Japanese defenders die in place, following orders to resist until death. The civilian population suffers catastrophically, caught between two armies locked in a battle neither can afford to lose. And overhead, the carriers of Task Force 58 continue operating. They launch strikes at dawn and recover them at dusk. They refuel from tankers, rearm from ammunition ships, and rotate aircraft through maintenance cycles. When kamikazes penetrate the screen and strike the carriers, the damage control parties fight the fires and patch the holes and restore the flight decks to operation. The cycle continues without pause. The USS Bunker Hill, after conducting limited flight operations for 6 days, departs the operating area on May 17th. She does not sink. She does not burn. She steams to Pearl Harbor under her own power, averaging 20 knots despite her damage. At Pearl Harbor, she enters dry dock for temporary repairs that will take 3 weeks. From there, she will proceed to Bremerton Naval Yard for permanent repairs. She will survive the war. She will be decommissioned in 1947 and eventually sold for scrap in 1973, living to see the jet age and the space age and the world that emerged from the war. But on May 11th, 1945, in the hours after the kamikaze attack, none of this future is certain. What is certain is that the ship's crew is fighting for survival with skills and equipment and doctrine that represent a revolution in naval warfare. They are demonstrating that carriers can be more than fragile striking platforms. They can be resilient weapon systems capable of absorbing damage and continuing to fight. The Japanese never learned this lesson because they run out of time. The kamikazes continue until August, when the atomic bombs end the war in a flash of nuclear fire. More than 3,800 kamikaze pilots die in attacks against the Allied fleet. They sink dozens of ships, mostly destroyers and smaller vessels that lack the damage control capabilities of fleet carriers. They kill nearly 5,000 Allied sailors and wound more than 4,000 others. But they do not stop the advance. In the decades after the war, historians will debate the kamikaze campaign's effectiveness. Some will argue it was a desperate tactic that achieved nothing beyond prolonging Japanese suffering. Others will suggest it inflicted significant damage and forced the Allies to adjust their tactics. But all will agree on one fundamental point. The kamikazes failed to sink or cripple enough American carriers to achieve their strategic objective. The reason for this failure is complex, involving factors ranging from American fighter defense to radar technology to fleet screening procedures. But at its core, the failure stems from a single miscalculation. The Japanese High Command assumed American carriers would respond to damage the same way Japanese carriers did. They assumed wrong. And in the difference between that assumption and reality, thousands of pilots flew to their deaths while the ships they targeted burned and recovered and returned to fight again.